So today I want to talk about two topics: pain and suffering. I know, not too upbeat, but very important topics, right? So specifically, I want to talk about the delineation between pain and suffering and the kind of complexity that exists between those two things. So first, let's start with what is pain, right? Pain. Now, I'm going to start using some simplifications here because I think that's the only real way to move forward with something like this, or else this whole reflection will be about defining pain. So let's keep it simple. I believe that pain is a biological phenomenon that we experience, which essentially alerts the body that something is very wrong or something is wrong. So the severity or acuity of pain could obviously depend on whatever you're going through. Having a cut or getting cut, having a illness, cancer, and or even feeling anxious about something. Now, those will all have some sort of texture of pain, but those textures are all different, right? There's certain pains in one realm that don't really translate over to other realm, but all of them are physiological in nature and are rooted in the biology of our body. And it depends on the situation you're in, but it will alert you to the fact that there is something wrong. Now, suffering, once again, a simplification. Suffering is more of a mental interpretation of that biological pain. Of course, with a lot of caveats here, and we're going to go into some of them here, or at least I'll try to delve into some of them. So the difference here is that, so the sentiment is that in some sense, pain and suffering are quite intertwined, but crucially, they can also be decoupled. So you can feel pain, for example, of let's say you get a cut on your finger or something like that. And that pain is there. It's frustrating. It's annoying. But you likely won't suffer over it for many reasons. One is that the pain threshold isn't high enough for that to automatically become suffering. And the second is that you know that this cut is a temporary phenomenon and the body is able to heal itself and will do everything it can to do that. So there's no real need to suffer over it, given that all you really need here is a little bit of time. Now, this is where it starts getting a little bit tricky, the correlation between pain and suffering, is that there are certain pains that exceed a certain threshold where I want to use the word inevitably, but I'm going to leave that out for now because I'm going to bring up an example that counters that. But it doesn't necessarily, it tends to translate into suffering more readily once a certain threshold is exceeded. Let's take a pretty obvious example. If you put your hand on a hot stove or put it over a burning fire for a while, that pain will be so excruciating that it will, the mental interpretation, there's just no room for interpretation in your mind. So it just immediately translates into this notion of suffering. Especially as you pull your hand out and now you're left with like a ashy stump, right? It sucks. But then again, even that argument has its limitations. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with that famous photo of a Vietnamese monk. I believe his last name is Duc, D-U-C. And I think the general context was that he was protesting against like the Catholic government's persecution of Buddhists. I believe he was a Mahayana Buddhist. And this iconic picture of him just completely ablaze on fire to demonstrate his protest. But you look at the guy and he is just his posture is just completely like this. And he is calm. Like this guy is just calm. While his entire body is on fire. Made me want to drink water. Okay, but You know what I'm saying. So that right there is one of the examples where it's like, okay, this guy is going through excruciating pain, probably the greatest degree of pain that one can feel at that, in that moment. Yet he has just, it looks like he has complete composure. Now, it's hard for us to tell whether he really wasn't suffering or not because, we're not him. But the general sentiment here is that the way he looked, the poise that he had, and the way that he died was, it seemed to be that he was free of suffering in the way that we view it. So there is this, so even that argument of after a certain point of pain, it has to translate to suffering, even that could be kind of faulty, right? So this problem of pain and suffering and of how do we ensure that the reality of pain, because if anything, pain is going to, that's one of the things that's a universal phenomenon. So, and given that the body inevitably breaks down, entropy does its thing, pain is something that is going to be felt. Now, how do we solve that problem of pain? If we can't do it biologically, then the only way we could really do that is mentally, and that is to alleviate the suffering element. So many schools of thought have tried to address this, right? And one of the popular schools of thought in the Western world is Stoicism. So for those of you unfamiliar with Stoicism, it was kind of championed by a few prominent guys: Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor, Epictetus. These folks, essentially, their view of the world was more about mitigating suffering. And they kind of tie it to expectations, where they're like, if you don't have immense or lofty expectations of the things that happen in your life, then you just won't experience suffering. So if you already have pictured, I think one of the famous parables is like Epictetus had some sort of expensive vase, and then it shattered and cracked, and he felt shitty about it. And the way he remedied that was to say, hey, the next time I have a vase, I'm already gonna imagine it being broken. Like, it's already broken. So that way, when it actually breaks, I'm like, that's just the way it is. I already knew that was gonna happen, so I just won't suffer over it. And then you scale that vase up to life itself. So what's the ultimate break? Death, right? So if I know that death is inevitability and it's going to come for all of us, then there's no need to fear it. And once it does arrive, that's cool too. So Stoicism has that element to it, where you essentially alleviate suffering by just not having too many expectations of the fact that you could avoid pain. And it's a compelling argument. It's a very compelling argument, because what it does is that it focuses on using your mind as the ultimate tool to be able to essentially battle the natural kind of decomposition of the human body, and also, like, as things happen in the world, you are able to not to have an indifference in a way. And that's what Nietzsche's criticism of Stoicism was, is that, like, this just seems to be a form of indifference, and it's a form of self-tyranny. So that is one of the reasons why Stoicism, to me, isn't as compelling as it is for a lot of people, because then it starts turning into this, like, okay, well, you just have to expect the worst. And when you have that kind of viewpoint, you play a very fine line between being this mental badass and being like a total fucking nihilist. And some people would argue that, but I think that if you're not equipped with the ability to truly internalize this, okay, lower my expectations, I could do that, like I'm an automaton, like a machine, then you're kind of in for a bumpy ride, because you're not sure how to, like, if you're kind of living your life with this numbed out view of expectations, then you're not really opening yourself up to the joys of it as well. So, and so the other kind of popular school of thought here are, the Buddhists, who kind of had this. The tenet here is that the sense of self, of having a sense of self, or the idea that you are a distinct individual navigating this world, and all the identities and attachments that come with that, that is the root of suffering. So that is why we internalize pain and take it to kind of a degree where we're mentally unable to handle it. So what they advocated for is to lose this sense of self through, there's just many practices, there's many frameworks that have been contributed or devised by the Buddha and others of how you could do that. But it's more about you remove that whole sense of I'm expecting something in the first place, because expectations come from the fact that you are you, and that you have individual desires and you have ways to manifest them into the world. But if you're able to not just curb your desires, but get rid of them entirely, then there is no space for suffering to arise. So now that is a compelling argument too. But the question here is, can we really lose our sense of desire, right? Desire is so firmly entrenched in not just who we are, but in our biology. So pain is, it's a very interesting thing to consider when it comes to how are you going to alleviate suffering in the midst of a kind of torrent of pain that occurs throughout life. And the way that I've kind of thought about this is that when I'm experiencing something that feels painful and feels like it's something that I just want to get rid of or overcome, I say to myself, okay, how much of this is a framing problem? How much of this is, if I were to contextualize it differently, then I can have I could take away so many better lessons from this pain. So one of my more recent examples, and this is a very surface level example, not serious at all, but I recently announced the course, and I found myself being just like nervous about it. Like, oh, well, how is the response going to be? How is it going to turn out? Am I saying the right things? Blah, blah. And then at some point I was like, this is not pleasant. It's not pleasant to think about it in this way. So then I kind of just thought about, like, why is this here? Why is this nervousness here? And then I realized, well, okay, it's here because I really care about this course, and I care that people will find it helpful, or that it would resonate and it's something that I could work on and build. And because I have that passion for it, I care about it so much, that's why I feel nervous about this whole thing. And when I saw it that way, it was like, oh shit, well, what if that nervousness, I just kind of package that emotion and then take it and internalize it more as excitement. Like, I'm just excited to get this out. And that excitement is there because this is just very enjoyable for me to do. And the thing is that the physiological elements of these things are very similar. It's just that when you frame it differently, you take away different lessons from it. So instead, it's like, okay, well, I'm just excited to get this out. So that's it. Like, once I'm excited about it, then with each response that comes in and stuff like that, I more so see it as, yeah, this is awesome. This is cool. Like, I'm glad I get to keep working on this, instead of, oh no, what's going to happen if things don't go well and stuff like that. So I think nervousness is more about the latter, and excitement kind of comes with the former. So, this is, once again, that's just a small example, but the question here is about how much can you scale this? How much can you scale this? Like, it would feel improper of me to go to someone that has cancer, for example, and is experiencing immense pain, And to say, well, if you just contextualize this cancer in a different manner, then you might feel better about it. Like and that's what I'm talking about, is that there's a certain threshold where that kind of suggestion that you are suffering and you can change your mindset about it starts feeling and looking really not just unkind, but silly and stupid in a way. So the main thing here is about cataloging the different things that you're struggling with and the pains that you're having, and seeing how much of that really can be contextualized and feels proper to contextualize, and which of these things are simply pains where it's not about framing it differently, but instead using it to be like, okay, are there certain lessons that I can take away from here that will push me away from hopelessness and into one of hope? So I think that's a good place to start with this. And by understanding that kind of dynamic with pain and suffering, and seeing how really suffering is a kind of it's just a way it's an interpretation of the pain, but also it's a way of telling us to not do that thing again, or to stay away from that pain again. And the faster that we can get out of that sense of suffering, the quicker we can learn our lessons. So that is kind of where I stand with it. I know that was just a big dump of all the things that I've been feeling about this topic, or thinking about this topic rather. And anytime you experience some pain in some format, the quicker you can get to asking yourselves these questions, I feel like the faster it could be alleviated and you can move on to much more beneficial things in life.